Hello and welcome to TRT World, live from Kilis, the Onjupinar crossing on the Turkish-Syrian border. I'm Anelise Borges, and over the next 60 minutes, I will bring you an in-depth look into a story that's made international headlines over the last few weeks. Turkey's operation inside Syria, Operation Olive Branch. We will be bringing you the latest updates from the front line, but also a look into how this operation has affected people on both sides of the border and what other countries think of Turkey's incursion into Syria. We will be live in Azaz, Syria, but also Ankara, Washington, and Moscow, and we will bring you analysis from our guests. But first, let's take a look at how Operation Olive Branch has unfolded so far. On January 20th, Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch alongside the Free Syrian Army. They have entered Afrin province with the aim of clearing the YPG from its border. And together they have been advancing on 7 different fronts. The latest development is that on Friday, the mission has managed to join up 2 of these fronts in the north, opening up a strategic corridor across the western Euphrates. TRT World's Sarah Firth brings you now an in-depth look at the operation so far and its impact on both sides of the border.
The arc of Syria's war has so far been long and complex. Now Turkey's military Operation Olive Branch to retake this border territory from the YPG, which Turkey considers a terror group, has arrived on the scene. 2 weeks in, and although some strategic positions have been taken, like Mount Basaya, progress is slow. Artillery bombardments continue on areas the Turkish military says are YPG-controlled. They are managing to retake YPG-held villages, like this one, on the road to Afrin. It's quiet here now, but signs of the recent fighting are everywhere. Mohammed Hamdou is just 22 years old. He's from an area near Afrin called Tel Rafat. The YPG took it over nearly 2 years ago.
The operation is about removing the PKK from these lands. All our Kurdish brothers here are against this separatist group. I hope the Afrin operation ends soon.
Turkey has the YPG firmly in its sights. It's long warned it's just another name for the PKK terror group. But evidence of the affiliation here with the PKK is clear to see. The nickname of the PKK leader graffitied on the wall. His image in the former YPG living quarters. But Turkey has come under criticism in this latest operation, its second military intervention into Syria since the start of the war. There are criticisms too over reports of civilian casualties and the timing of the operation in Afrin. We put these questions to the Kilis mayor. If the YPG on the borders has proven such a threat to this region, why hasn't more been done in Kilis sooner? Why is he only now that the operation is happening?
This region, Kilis, has become a place where terror groups have positioned themselves. Just opposite side of the border was captured by Daesh. Just next to that, YPG and PKK captured the area. These groups were quickly start to threaten us. As you know, 2 years ago, Daesh hit Turkey with more than 100 rockets. Many of our people died.
In a hospital in Kilis, an injured FSA soldier shows us his wounds. This is just one of the challenges the Turkish military are up against. Unexploded ordnance, they say, is from the YPG. Well, what you've just seen there is the Turkish military detonating some unexploded artillery that they say came from the YPG. Now, that area had been secured by the Turkish military. They'd been down there, they'd cleared back the area, And this just goes to show you, this is the front line on Mount Basaya that the Turkish military took in recent days. It's the front line of Operation Olive Branch. And the Turkish soldiers that we've been speaking to say things like this unexploded artillery are part of the challenges that they face in this operation as it continues. The YPG have been returning fire. We travelled to the site of one YPG hit. A resident who's lived here for many years since fleeing from Syria gave us his thoughts. You heard the bomb?
The rocket hit here. There were children, there were women. We didn't know what to do. We are really tired.
It's a sentiment repeated over and over, whether you speak to Syrians in refugee camps, FSA soldiers, or Turkish residents. Everyone says they're tired of this war.
And I'm now joined by Sarah Firth, who's live for us in Azaz in Syria, and also Kurt Nikili, who's live for us in Kilis, the city that has been the site of yet another rocket attack this Friday. But let me cross first to Sarah Firth, who is near the battlefield. Sarah, what's happening at the moment where you are?
Well, as you said, we're here in northern Syria in an area called Azaz, and the Operation Olive Branch front line is literally just a couple of kilometres up this mountain that you can see behind me here. This is Mount Basaya. It's a very strategic point that the Turkish military were able to take, and all throughout this morning, actually, we've heard very heavy outgoing artillery once again from the Turkish military as they're firing on those YPG positions. Now remember, Turkey considers the YPG the Syrian branch of the PKK. I spent the last couple of days actually up on the front line. They've closed off access to the front line for now for operational security reasons, but it is very active indeed. As I said, very heavy outgoing artillery. They're trying now to push the YPG out of territory closer to Afrin, and the longer term aims stated by the Turkish military is to secure Turkey's borders, and we're very, very close right now to Turkey's border. Obviously, we're on the Syrian side, but it's all happening in a very close area. So that operation very, very much ongoing. And as you heard in my report there, pretty much everyone we're talking to is pretty tired of this war in Syria, and Operation Olive Branch has been another complication in an already very complex situation. What we're hearing from the Turkish military is they are making progress. At this point, they say some 800 YPG and Daesh fighters have either been killed or captured or wounded on the battlefield, but it is going to be a long process. This terrain around us here is very difficult terrain for a military operation, and it's terrain until recently the YPG held, so they know this area very well. And also the Turkish military have made clear about the reports of civilian casualties as a result of this operation, that part of the reason it is so slow is because they are carrying out precision strikes. They're being very, very careful about the positions that they're hitting, that they say are just YPG positions. But as we said, even in the last 10 minutes or so, we've had the sounds of the artillery in the background as that operation continues.
Indeed, and we can also hear it from here, Sarah. And you've, as you said, you've been following this story very closely over the last few days. You have spoken to both Turkish soldiers, but also soldiers fighting with the Free Syrian Army. What is in your view, what is the morale of the troops? What have they been telling you about Operation Olive Branch?
Well, everyone's very clear that they want to remove the YPG from the area, and I think one of the interesting parts of Operation Olive Branch is that you've had a lot of confusion in the narrative about the YPG PKK links. As we said, the Turkish military consider the YPG the Syrian branch of the PKK, and the PKK is a designated terror group. Now, just the other day, we were in one of the villages that the Turkish military retook, and you could see everywhere where the YPG had fled when the Free Syrian Army moved in with the Turkish military backing. And the Free Syrian Army soldiers were telling us that, look, showing us the signs of the graffiti on the walls. You had the leader of the PKK graffitied on the walls, so it was very clear that whilst the battle is ongoing, that is the stated aim, to remove this group that's considered a terror group by Turkey from these border areas. But of course, on both sides, there's a lot of concern for civilians about their safety.
Indeed. Sarah Firth, live for us in Azaz, near the front line. Thank you very much. Stay safe, Sarah. I want to bring in now Courtney Kelly, who's standing by for us in Kilis. And Courtney, as Sarah Firth was mentioning just a moment ago, there's a lot of concern for civilians. And while for some this is a very distant operation, for others this military incursion is happening right on their backyard. I'm talking about the city of Kilis. The city of Kilis that has actually been the site of yet another attack. YPG attack is believed as a response to this operation. What have people in Kilis been telling you about Operation Olive Branch?
Well, they've been telling me that they're strong. To tell my audience that, and our audience, that they're very, very strong. And as you can see behind me, life goes on. There's commerce. The shops are open. Gentlemen are smoking narghile nearby. There are people riding their motorcycles after Friday prayers, selling vegetables, children walking with their mothers. Now, this is not indifference, or this is just hours after a rocket attack. And as we go into the second week of the operation, there have been several rocket attacks here. This morning, Friday prayers were not held at the Chalak Mosque. Now, that mosque, a 17th century mosque, was hit in the first week of the operation. 2 people were killed, a Turkish citizen and a Syrian refugee. We spoke to the imam today. He has a punctured eardrum. He said last Friday, this Friday, 2 Fridays since the operation began, that it's the first time since this mosque was built and renovated that he can recall that there haven't been Friday prayers. They were canceled after several rocket attacks again, even though they had planned to commemorate the victims. He instead today is going to the hospital to pay condolences and give support to the many wounded in the hospital.
All right, Courtney Kelly, live for us in Kili. Thank you very much for this update. I want to bring in now our guest, Onur Emir, a political analyst and advisor. How much has been achieved so far through Operation Olive Branch, in your opinion?
Well, President Erdogan and the rest of Turkey, seems to be a unified decision by everybody, has gone in there with a very, very clear and a very specific plan. It was to clear the YPG PKK terrorists off the Turkish border first, hence securing Turkish border and the nearby towns. Right now, that is it seems to be going on its course with great success. But the Turkish military is not just going in there and eliminating the terrorists, it is also making sure that the areas that they clear are secure, so they don't have to go back and redo things. So things are taking a little bit of time. Of course, there is much emphasis, probably nothing like ever seen before, on trying to keep the civilian casualties to a minimum level. Despite some black media attempts by PKK YPG, Turkey and the Turkish military forces are very, very careful about that point.
You were talking about how this is a unified decision, that how Turkey is united. Surely there are concerns and criticisms over this operation. The end game here for Turkey is really to eliminate the YPG from its borders. I want to hear from you, can it be done, and how complex will it be? How long can it take, for example?
What we have seen so far, and what some of us predict, that Turkey's Operation Olive Branch, which basically consists of the Afrin section of Syria, will not bring too much trouble. What is in question is when Turkey, if Turkey needs to move on for the rest of the northern Syrian border until Iraq, that could be a little more problematic than what we have so far, thus far, faced or not faced really in Afrin. Turkey and President Erdogan is the least bit concerned with going into a war, going into rest of northern Iraq. I think we're all expecting the major powers in the region to work along with Turkey to accept Turkey's genuine concern as to why we went into this region. Anelise, I've been to Kilis for the first time in my life. It's been about 3 or 4 hours. I could already tell from inside the Kilis the difference between an incoming and an outgoing rocket. That's the real concern. That's what we're worried about.
And just goes another one.
There you go.
We can keep
if
hearing.
President Erdogan had said we're going to clear entire YPG and PKK terrorists from Syria or wherever they are, he has a right to do that, but he hasn't. All he said is we want to make sure our borders are cleared, our towns are safe. That is it.
Okay, so that should include going to Manbij next, because of course the danger here is to eliminate this threat that Turkey sees as a threat in one area and then it moves to the next. What do you see it being the next steps with Operation Olive Branch?
I think we're all hoping that one of the superpowers in the world, the US, who has armed YPG PKK, would have the power to make sure to pull them off the area where Turkey is concerned with. If that isn't done, it's not a question whether Turkey will or will not, can or cannot, it's a question of when. Because this is not something that Turkey would like to do, it's something that Turkey will have to do, period.
Onur Ömer, thank you very much for joining us here for this special edition on TRT World. And as you were saying, throughout the war in Syria, Turkey has repeatedly said that the YPG was a threat because Turkey sees it as an offshoot of the PKK, an internationally recognized terror organization. But its main ally, the United States, has refused to accept that fact. TRT World's Alijan Ayanlar now takes a look at why Turkey believes the YPG and the PKK are part of the same organization.
After months of battling Daesh, US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces ousted the terror group in October from its self-declared capital in Raqqa. Soon after the liberation, SDF militants displayed posters of Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned former leader of the PKK terror group. It was a sign that many of the fighters who retook Raqqa were members of the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK. The U.S. considers the PKK as a terrorist organization, but it's been providing weapons and training to its Syrian affiliate.
Unfortunately, some of our allies say we did not provide weapons to the terrorist organization, but we see and monitor and have evidence that they are helping the terrorist organizations with weapons. Who are you cheating? These are all known facts.
But he's had difficulty in persuading its NATO ally of links between the PKK and YPG. But putting the YPG under the umbrella of the SDF to avoid any obvious links to the PKK didn't prove that they were not related, just that it was all a carefully orchestrated branding exercise by the US military.
Now, interestingly, they came about that name because at one point in time, and I dealt with them directly, I was on the formative stage of the relationship with these guys. They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere, but it gave them a little bit of credibility.
But that credibility had no legs with Turkey, and its patience is running thin.
And for more on this story, I'm now joined by TRT World's defense analyst, Obey Shandar. Thank you very much, Obey, for joining us here for this special edition. Turkey and the US have clearly very different views on the YPG and on its links to the PKK. However, the United States has accepted the PKK as a terror organization. Why hasn't it been able to verify or to justify Turkey's allegations that they are indeed linked?
There's a major gap between the U.S. policy on the YPG and their front group, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and of course Turkey's position on this issue. Where there isn't a gap is technically the United States does recognize the PKK as a terror entity. It was just last year that the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, actually testified in front of the U.S. Congress, making it very clear that not only is the PKK a terror group, but there are connections between the PKK and the YPG. Now, as we just heard, there was an effort by senior U.S. officials, specifically the U.S. representative to the anti-Daesh coalition, Brett McGurk, to rebrand the YPG to the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces that would allow the U.S. to provide weapons and training and additional military support to this terror group in eastern Syria while avoiding technically breaking any laws, although it's very clear that the Syrian Democratic Forces have actually been making statements in support of the YPG in Afrin and elsewhere. And the connections are so clear that senior PKK leaders such as Polat Can were one of the founders of the YPG and the SDF and worked closely with U.S. forces and U.S. officials. So while officially the U.S. doesn't recognize the YPG as being the SDF, they are almost surely aware of the connections between the leadership of the organizations and their overall ideology.
I want you to stay with us, Obey, because while the YPG had said that Turkey was targeting civilians during this Operation Olive Branch, there have been numerous allegations against the YPG and the PKK over its human rights violations. TRT World's Rahul Radhakrishnan reports on an exclusive story about these allegations over the YPG.
This 14-year-old Yazidi girl was kidnapped from her home in northern Iraq by members of the YPG terror group. They wanted to make her a fighter. She's now free, but we're concealing her identity for her safety.
They told us they wanted us to learn to fight and blow ourselves up. They told us they wanted us to do that to strengthen the YPG power. We said, we can't, we are Yazidis. We want to strengthen the Yazidis' power. They said, let's make the guerrillas' power greater.
Part of the YPG's tactics, she says, was using female fighters to recruit children.
They told us our main enemies were the Peshmerga and the Turkish government, and that we must blow ourselves up against them. They were very nasty to Yazidi girls. We hope the international community will oust the PKK from the Shingal mountain, or do something for the Yazidis. They killed Yazidis every day. All our friends there are afraid to move.
Last year, Human Rights Watch released evidence that the YPG and its women's branch used child soldiers. Other human rights watchdogs also say that the YPG had carried out torture and forced people from their homes in areas it controls. Some YPG militants captured by the Free Syrian Army recently in Afrin have reportedly confirmed those allegations. This man's brother was recruited by the YPG. He says the group brainwashed him.
He would tell us what happened during his assignments. The main lesson was to love the leader, Abdullah Öcalan. All their political lessons were about loving the leader. After a while, we went to visit him. We couldn't find him or our friends who were with him. We asked about them and they told us they'd been taken to the Battle of Raqqa. After some time, we were told he'd been martyred. We asked to see his body. They did not approve it. The coffin had a photo of him, but it was covered in flags. It also had his activist name written on it, not his real name. They had completely changed his identity. We are not the only ones suffering like this. Many other people are suffering too.
Abuses by the YPG's political arm, the PYD, have also been reported.
The PYD has really established a kind of, you can only call it dictatorial rule. There is no opposition at all anymore in the Kurdish areas because, there is, of course, the Kurdish National Council, which is in opposition to the PYD, but all their offices, for example, have been closed. No demonstrations which are criticizing either the PYD or the Syrian regime can take place. But this is something which is very often not seen, and particularly in the Western media, which likes to see the YPG as heroes fighting together with the Americans against the Islamic State.
Turkey and Syria share an 800-kilometer border. A large chunk of that is held by the YPG. And for Turkey, securing its border has become an issue of national security. Turkey says its offensive against the YPG in northern Syria protects not only Syrian civilians, but also its own people. But a number of cities still remain under the YPG's control, and so do thousands of civilians. Rahul Radhakrishnan, TRT World.
And now, Ubay, while it's hard to prove everything that goes on in a war, these allegations against the YPG, have they been presented to the group's supporters, to countries like Turkey and the US? And has there been any reaction in terms of how the operation is unfolding?
Well, there's been certainly a major amount of anecdotal evidence in the areas where the YPG is occupied, well outside its traditional areas of influence, specifically in the Arab villages. Complaints from local villagers and townspeople made to international organizations and made to international media and also to TRT World. As you can see, some more outgoing here as we're speaking. Now, and of course there have been human rights watch reports, specifically of the YPG, as we just heard, recruiting child soldiers. What's interesting here is that in its information campaigns and its propaganda campaigns, the YPG is claiming to Western media that is actually protecting the Yazidis in Afrin, while here we've seen some really stark evidence of the YPG actually abusing the Yazidi communities in Iraq. So while this evidence has been certainly it's available to the U.S. military and the U.S. coalition that's supporting the YPG, it still has not stopped the U.S. from continuing its military support to this organization.
And we've getting reports as well in terms of what's happening on the ground, that similarly to what happened with Daesh, that there are foreign fighters involved in this fight, notably alongside the YPG. What happens to them when they're captured? Are they going to be returned to their countries? I mean, Turkey is a member of NATO. How does this work?
That's a very important question. The YPG, from its earliest inception, has been using foreign fighters, many of them recruited from Europe and the US and North America. And they've used them in the battlefield against Daesh, but we've also seen a statement, interestingly enough, by the Syrian Democratic Forces of moving some of these YPG foreign fighters into Afrin. So there's indicators here that the Syrian Democratic Forces, the cover name for the YPG, may actually be using some of these foreign fighters, moving them through Assad regime-controlled territory into Afrin. This is, of course, despite denials made by the U.S. and by Pentagon officials that there's a connection between the YPG terror group in Afrin and the Syrian Democratic Forces. But clearly, both the YPG and the SDF do not view that there's a difference between the two organizations. These foreign fighters are extremists, and they are no different than the foreign fighters that are joining Daesh and in terms of their extremist ideology. And it's clear that they're being used to be sent in Afrin to fight the Free Syrian Army and to fight Turkish soldiers at the behest of the YPG and possibly Syrian Democratic Forces leadership.
Ubay Shabandar, thank you very much for this analysis. We are going to take a quick break now. When we come back, how are other countries perceiving the operation here in northern Syria? We will be live in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. Stay with us.